All right, TJ, today at noon, which by the time people watch this, it probably will be up and running, and that is the legal tampering period. You got 2 days, today and tomorrow, leading up to when free agency actually starts, the start of the new league year, which is Wednesday at 4 o'clock, for teams to be talking to free agents, negotiating with representatives, and coming to agreement that will obviously be finalized when the new league year starts on Wednesday. What I want to talk about today is some of the guys that the Lions should be targeting, but I want to start off with, we learned this morning that Graham Glasgow and the Detroit Lions reached a new contract, 3 years, $20 million, 9.5 guaranteed. I'd love to hear your thoughts on them bringing Graham Glasgow back.
Yeah, well, you solidified a piece of that offensive line, right? We knew that there was going to be some holes there with Jonah Jackson and Graham being free agents. I think it's the right move to bring Graham back. I think he clearly showed last year how valuable he is to this team. And remember, they brought him in on a 1-year deal to kind of be that sixth man, right? He didn't really get an opportunity to earn a starting spot in training camp because Frank Ragnow was missing a lot of time. Vaitai was missing a lot of time. Like he kind of had to float in a bunch of different positions where he didn't really get to focus on that right guard spot until later in training camp when Vaitai ended up going back on the IR and it was Graham's job. And then after the rest of the season, he solidified that guard spot. He had to play a couple games at center, with Frank kind of in and out. But I think, look, Graham is an underrated player, not only on this team but in the league. The stability that he brings, and at a price tag that is probably going to be a third of what other guards are going to get on this market. Mm-hmm. I mean, Kevin Dotson was a guy from the Rams that signed for $16 million a year. I know he's younger, but if you watch the tape of those two guys, it's not a glaring difference between saying, oh, Kevin Dotson's on a whole different level than Graham Glasgow. They're both solid players. So, and look, for me, you're getting two players, right? You're getting two for the price of one. You're getting a starting guard. He's going to be penciled in as the starting right guard for this team, but you're also getting a heck of a high talented backup center, right? Which we know, especially on this team with Frank Ragnow, he's had kind of some unlucky injuries pop up over the last few years. We know that that's always going to be kind of a small concern of his availability, and it's only going to continue to grow the older that he gets. So I'm not saying Frank is injury prone or anything like this, but that's a position to me on this team that you have to address, because both of those guys, and especially with Frank, we know how valuable he is to this team. If something happens to him and you can fill in somebody else with a guy like Graham Glasgow, that's going to allow you to kind of at least stay on the same track. So I love the signing. I'm happy for Graham. I'm happy that he gets to settle back down here in Michigan. He obviously made it clear that he wanted to be here, and I think that guys like that are important to keep around. And the price tag, I think, man, it actually seems like a bargain when we start finding out over the next couple of days what offensive guards in particular are going to start getting paid here in free agency.
So I agree. I think it's a good price to get Graham at, and consistency up front with this offense, with Jared Goff, and the uncertainty of Frank, because he's got the foot where it's always going to be an issue. He mentioned it last offseason. It's something that can't be surgically repaired, and he's going to have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And he has, but there are going to be games where, are we likely to see him play a 17-game season again? Probably not. 15, 14 at times. When you have a guy like Graham that can step in there, that Jared Goff is very comfortable with. And I think that's the big tell. Now, the other guard, and I want to ask you this, because you mentioned Dotson out in LA signed for 3 for $48, $16 million. And it's not a glaring difference between what Dotson does and what Graham Glasgow brings. Now, Jonah Jackson, knowing that they've set the bar a little bit with, 3 years, $20 million. Jonah is younger.
Yeah.
But again, I don't think he is that much far above what Graham Glasgow brings. And so, yeah, in the run game, maybe he gets a little bit more push as a pass protector. It's kind of a wash to me. So when you look at what they paid Graham, do you think that if Jonah goes out there and gets a contract offer that's close to Dotson, say maybe it's 15, 16 a year, do you think Brad Holmes says, thank you for your time, but we're not going to pay that?
Yeah, I do. And honestly, I'm kind of in the boat where I don't really have any expectation whatsoever that Jonah's coming back. I just think that he's going to like you said, he's going to garner too much interest on the open market. And look, when you talk about the difference between Jonah and Graham, look, Jonah's coming out of his 4th year, right? So I think that when you look at maybe the ceiling of both players, Jonah's is probably higher. We know what Graham is. Graham's been in the NFL for a long time now, right? I think Jonah is going to continue to get better by the time he gets to year 5, 6, 7. So I think that may be where he's going to garner a lot more interest than a veteran guard like Graham himself would have gotten. A lot of teams can look at Jonah and say he could be a long-term option. We can give him a 4-5-year deal and have him here for, until he's year 9, year 10, and maybe hits free agency again. Graham's already at that kind of third contract level. So, but no, I think that, look, in my mind, if they wanted Jonah back bad enough, this deal would have been done, for a couple months ago, right? Because the writing was on the wall for guards this year to get probably overpaid because there's not a lot of tackles on the market, and teams need offensive linemen every single year. So I think knowing that going into free agency, and still there's no way in hell you would say, hey, let's open the market up and see what you're going to get, and then we'll get involved. You should have done, if you wanted him back, you would have gotten him, a couple months ago at a deal that was fair to both of you. So I don't think Jonah's coming back either way, which is a bummer because I do like Jonah a lot. I think he's a great player, and I think he's got a really bright future as eventually one of the top guards in the league. But I just don't that writing on the wall for me has kind of seemed to come and go. I think Jonah is probably moving on, and I think he's going to get a heck of a contract that maybe a lot of Lions fans are looking at and saying, whoa, right? Like that surprised me, but I'm telling you, we've been talking about it for a couple weeks now. Don't be surprised. If you see Jonah getting up to 12, 14, $16 million a year deal, because a lot of teams look at him as being one of the top guards on this market.
And you and I both, we kind of came at it a different way regarding the extra money that teams have with the increase of the salary cap. Mine was, I think there are teams that are going to keep guys, whether they franchise tag them or they're going to extend them, as opposed to letting them hit the open market because they're able to spend a little bit more money. They got some extra in their bank account this year. And yours was, I believe it was, hey, there's going to be somebody out there that's going to overpay. Just like whether you believe it's overpaying or not, Jonah Jackson is going to go somewhere where they're going to pay him more than the Lions are willing to pay him. And there's going to be some other guys. And I'm curious, before we start talking about other guys that we want the Lions to pursue in this first stage of free agency. Now, we all know the way this goes is the big dogs are going to get signed first. Those are the ones that teams are going to go after. And then there's going to be a lull. Then there's going to be a second phase and a third phase. And it's going to take, some time to work your way down. But in the group of free agents, how active do you expect the Detroit Lions to be in this legal tampering and into the first couple of days of free agency?
The first couple days, maybe I don't expect a big move. I would love one. Look, I'd love it at noon on Monday at the time of this recording. If there's reports about the Lions and Christian Wilkins,
right,
having deals, I would love that. Do I expect that? I don't think I do. I think I expect by the end of the week, because look, a lot of these veteran free agents, sometimes they sit out the first couple of days and just say, let's see where the market's at. Okay, let's see. Now a team, we're going into Thursday, Friday. They didn't land anybody they wanted. Maybe they're going to come up on their price a little bit. Okay, that's going to be good for me to take advantage of. I think the Lions, and look, we kind of hinted at this over the last couple of weeks. It seems that a lot more maybe of the short-term deals for veteran guys is in play than maybe some of the Christian Wilkins, we're going to give you a 5-year deal, or L'Jarius Sneed, we're going to give you, that's going to have to be a trade, but give you a 5-year deal. I don't know if that's as much in play as maybe some of these veteran free agents that you say, hey, we'll give you a year, whatever, name the price. And that's going to probably come later in the week. However, I do expect that, when things start to slow down, they have to come out of this free agency, in my opinion, with at least 2 starters. All right. And I don't care if it's a high end guy like a Christian Wilkins, or if it's a veteran guy that you got on a 1 or a 2-year deal. As long as you come out of this free agency, in my opinion, with 2 starters, that Brad Holmes is doing his job. And particularly, we talked about it last week, and Brad even said free agency is a time where you need to fill needs. Well, I think two of the biggest needs now after Graham signing are defensive line and secondary. It's secondary probably being number one for me, right? Cam Sutton, I think, is the only corner that you have under contract. Right. So you're going to have to come out of this free agency with hopefully two starters, in my opinion. And I wouldn't mind if they're both in the secondary. I wouldn't mind if you got one in the secondary and maybe a veteran guy that can come in and be a big part of your defensive front. So that for me is, I think, a realistic expectation. But, you know, the Lions have never been in this position before, you know, so who knows? I don't know if Brad Holmes is going to take a page out of the Rams playbook from a couple years ago when they said, man, we're ready right now. Maybe it's time to be aggressive. I don't know. I don't have that answer. I'm just giving you my speculation, what I think is going to happen. Yeah. And I would honestly probably be surprised if they were able to land a guy like Christian Wilkins or land a guy like L'Jarius Sneed. I think that would surprise me a little bit based off of what they've told us, right? And Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell normally are pretty honest when they talk in front of the media. They don't come out and say, we're not going to spend money. And then, oh my God, they got four guys. What were they talking about? Like, no, I know, but they've kind of said, they've had the same message even from the combine a couple of weeks ago during their, press conferences. And, hey, like, don't get your hopes up. We're going to be smart. We're going to try to fill some gaps. But, so part of me wants to believe them, but part of me also wants to think that maybe they will be a little bit more aggressive since they know that they're very close, right? So I don't know. I mean, this is going to be a fun couple days to see how active they are. Yeah. But what are your expectations? I mean, do you expect them to go after, some high name guys? Do you expect it? Because depending on which, website or media the outlet that you follow, they all have a list of free agents, right? And they're ranked 1 to 100. And I was looking at one, and it's like, basically what you said earlier, that since the salary cap went up, maybe a lot of guys got deals, maybe a lot of guys got tagged that teams wouldn't have done that. So you were spot on with that one. But the one I was looking at, the top 15 free agents, I think 12 or 13 of them have already gone back to their team on either a deal or a franchise tag. So that's probably good for a guy like Christian Wilkins, who was going to play the number 2 to Chris Jones when today opened up. Well, all of a sudden he's the front guy, right? So he's going to get broke off somehow. And that's why I'm saying he's going to be one of those guys that if the Lions don't get involved in, we're probably going to look at it and say, holy crap, somebody paid him $28 million a year. You know what I mean? Like, because he's like one of the only options. But what do you expect the Lions to be able to accomplish over the next couple of days?
At a minimum, I need to hear, and we know you and I both have been through this process where agents are going to leak things. And whether it's to try and get their client, more leverage, more money, like there's going to be things that leak out. And so I want to know that they were at least in the conversation. Did they approach Christian Wilkins and his agent and say, here, we'd love to have you come to Detroit. Let's start talking about a contract. And do they get to a point where Christian Wilkins, somebody's going to overpay him and they say, we're willing to pay you 23, maybe 24 a year, but somebody's going to pay him 28. And then all of a sudden Brad Holmes says, hey, appreciate it. You're out of our price range. But I want to know that they were in that conversation. Same thing with Danielle Hunter. I want to at least know that they've made some of those calls and inquired into, hey, if you're going to sign for market value, whatever market value means these days, then we're going to be in it. But if you're going to blow the market away, we're not going to set the market on an edge rusher, on a corner, on a defensive lineman, but we're willing to pay market value. And so then a player has to decide, is it simply the money that I'm going for? And you and I both know that could be the only determining factor. A guy says, I want the maximum amount of dollars. I want the maximum amount of guarantees. Yeah. Whoever provides that, that's where I'm going. And I don't care. I'm a hired assassin.
And normally that happens with guys going into their second contract, right? They're coming off of a rookie deal. A lot of guys look at it. I have one big chance to get paid. A guy like Christian Wilkins, I've got this one chance to just go make as much money as I possibly can. I think a lot of times when you get into, well, do you want to take more money and play on a bad team or maybe take a little less and play on a good team? You get that a lot more with veteran guys that just want to go and say, you know what, I'm not going to go waste my career in Washington, right? Who's rebuilding right now, who's nobody's going to expect them to do anything for at least a couple years. You're not going to see a lot of veteran free agents say, well, I'm going to go there because they're going to pay me money, right? A lot of those guys are going to say, hey, maybe I'll take a couple million less to go play for a team that has a chance to win, because your
legacy,
your motivations change, right? The older you get. So I think that's a good distinction. Is a lot of these guys that you see, they're 25, 26, 27, that might be going into their second contract, are going to want to get broke off. Like they're going to want to make the most money that you can, which I think, look, at the end of the day, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. You got to do what you got to do. And we all know that in the NFL, you only get so many opportunities to get paid. So, but I don't think you're going to see a lot of guys that said, oh man, Christian Wilkins had $28 million on the table from this team and he took 24 to go with a good team. I don't think you're going to see that with those guys.
And it'll be interesting because we've also seen the Buffalo Bills cut a lot of players simply because they wanted to get under the cap. And when you sign a big deal as your second contract, that, hey, in years 4 or 5, some of those numbers are not realistic. You're either going to have to restructure your contract and extend it, which it generally means more money for the player, or, hey, do you want to sign a contract that's more realistic, that you're going to play it out and see the total dollars,
right?
And that's where it comes down to. Some guys go, hey, I want this to look like it's the richest contract the defensive lineman has ever seen, or at least next closest to Chris Jones, versus what's the real money that I'm going to actually see? What's realistic? If I going to get to year 4 and still be playing on this contract, or am I going to get to year 4 and be a cap casualty? And if that's the case, and you're still playing at a high level, you're going to go break the bank somewhere else. So there's a lot of different variables.
Well, and a lot of times with players, it still comes down to guaranteed money, like you're saying, right? On paper, does it make sense for me to sign a 5-year deal worth $30 million, but I'm only getting half guaranteed? Or does it make more sense to sign a 5-year deal for $27 million, but maybe I've got 80% of it guaranteed, right? So a lot of those depend on how teams opt to structure those contracts.
Yeah, and how comfortable you are and in your ability to stay healthy and your ability to continue to perform at a high level. So let's get into the 5 guys. And having listened to you, there's a chance that our 5 guys may not overlap, because I do think that they should be in the conversation for some of those top guys. So I have a couple of those on my list. So let's alternate. I'll let you go first on who is the number 1 guy on your free agent
list. I'm going to do this in 2 tiers. Okay. I'm going to give you, I'm going to give you a couple guys that would be on my free agent list that we're probably going to have similar. And then I'm going to give you a couple guys that I think are going to be a more realistic target for what the Detroit Lions are going to be. Okay. So I'm going to start number 1. Obviously, my wish list, if I could get one guy from this free agent class to bring in to the Detroit Lions, it would be Danielle Hunter. And that's probably going to cost you upwards of $25 million a year, whatever that looks like. But he's a guy I think that has probably another 3 or 4 years of his prime. He is an every down player. He seems, from all reports, and I played against Danielle Hunter, he seems like a guy that would fit this culture. He seems like a guy that would be able to come in from day one and just take that defense to an entire different level. Giving you an every down. He's not just a situational guy that you're going to pay $20 million to play 10 snaps or 15 snaps on third down. He's going to be an every down guy. The impact that a guy like that could have on this defense, I think, would be monumental to any other free agent that they could possibly bring in. So Danielle Hunter, if I had my pick, TJ's pick, I'm going out there and telling Danielle Hunter, you're going to be a Detroit Lion. We're going to pay you. I don't care what the market looks like. Get your ass in Honolulu Blue. Get over here. We need a guy like you.
All right. So before you give me your phase 2 of edge rushers, I want to give you my number 1 guy. My number 1 guy. So I didn't play against any of these guys. So we are now.
Oh yeah, you're old.
Past any of
There's no 30-year veterans still playing.
And so when I'm looking at these guys, and I'm kind of going with what I know. I don't know what Danielle Hunter, what he's like in the locker room. I don't know, and honestly, we don't know any of these guys, but I know a little bit more about one of these individuals, and that's Christian Wilkins. I had a chance to cover him when he was at Clemson, meet him when they played Alabama in one of the national championship games, talk to Dabo and talk to some of his teammates, and I actually had a chance to get to know him just a little bit. And this is a dude that fits exactly what you would think Dan Campbell, Brad Holmes would be guys that they would want to draft. Now that they're free agents, I think would be guys that they could identify that you insert them in this locker room and they're great culture guys. Christian Wilkins, to me, is a great culture guy. And like I mentioned, I had a chance to get to know him a little bit in his last year at Clemson. And in talking to some individuals down at Miami, he was the absolute leader of that defense. He was a guy that played every snap, never came out of the game, always showed up to practice, would play through nicks, bumps, injuries, and was a guy that I believe if you got a definition that is a Dan Campbell guy, it would be Christian Wilkins. And a guy that if you're going to pay $25 million a year, Christian Wilkins fits everything that I believe they're looking for. So he would be the number one guy that I would target. Not to say that Danielle Hunter's not, or some of these other edge guys couldn't be, but he is the guy that I think is closest to and I know the most about, and I would love to add him to this defensive front.
Yep, and makes sense. It's hard to argue, and I think everybody would obviously love to see a guy like Christian Wilkins' stature on this defensive line. I'm going to go with my tier 2 guys. I'm going to stick with the edge. I'm going to give you a couple names here that I think are going to be more likely to be targeted from Brad Holmes. And the first one, and I was driving in this morning, listening to your morning show, and Costa kind of stole my thunder on this, but Danico Autry is a guy who, look, he's 33. He's been in the league for a long time. I played, I think it was in Oakland, at the start of his career. Last couple of years was with Tennessee. Their team wasn't he's been a guy that's kind of under the radar. 12 sacks last year as a kind of 5-tech, move inside on interior pass rush positions.
Great connection with the defensive
line.
Right.
And, I'm trying not to be lazy here and just say, let's pick all the coaches where they came from and find the free agents. But I think Danico Autry is a guy that obviously Terrell Williams would know if he is able to fit this Dan Campbell culture. And obviously I think these coaches like players that have a connection that they know about. We know that character. We know that high character. We know values play a big part in the players that they bring in. I think if Danico Autry fits that model, then he could be a guy that I think the Lions would go after maybe later on in the market, not maybe a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but maybe a Thursday, Friday to bring a guy like that in onto one-year deal or a 2-year deal. I think he would be a guy that would be realistic that could say, that's a hell of a team over there in Detroit. They've got an opening. I can go there and I'm not going to be a backup. He's probably going to be a starter for at least another year. And I think he could really help this team. And he's had, I think 8+ sacks in the last 4 years. He's a pretty consistent guy when you look at his stats, and he wreaks havoc too. I mean, when you turn the film on, and he's a name that not a lot of people know, but if the Lions were able to land him on one of those shorter term deals, a veteran contract, 1 year, $10 million, 2 year, $18 million, I would be thrilled with that. I think he's a guy that could definitely help out. And another guy too, look, there's probably 2 guys I'm going to throw in the same category here. One is Jadeveon Clowney, and the other one is Zadarius Smith. Now, Zadarius Smith, we remember from Green Bay, had a couple really phenomenal years, had some back issues that he ended up missing some time there, went to Minnesota a couple years ago, was really damn good. And then last year, I think, was in Cleveland, where he had he's just extremely disruptive. He's a guy that's 31, Zadarius Smith, that I think he's one of the best interior pass rushers. You can put him on the outside on early downs and then the inside on pass rush downs, and he could be a guy that would tremendously help Aiden Hutchinson. He's got a vast amount of moves. He is a versatile guy. He can play all over that defensive front. I think another guy that would fit that mold of maybe bringing in on a 1 or 2 year deal and kind of giving him that, hey, we got a chance to play for a Super Bowl. I think that could be a guy that would interest them as well. If they were able to go after and target a guy like Zadarius Smith or Jadeveon Clowney, who's kind of had a similar path, bounced around on a bunch of different teams, was with the Ravens last year, obviously one of the best defenses in the NFL. Those can be a couple pass rush guys that I think would. The Jadeveon Clowney, I don't know much about on the personality side. I think there's maybe a reason why he's been on so many different teams over the last couple of years.
He's productive everywhere,
but he's
goes.
productive, right? And he kind of seems to be one of those guys that maybe it took him a little longer to figure out now that he's probably in his 8th or 9th year. But I think those could be a couple guys where if I heard the Lions targeting either one of those players, I'd be pretty excited because I think they bring a lot of juice to that pass rush up front.
Yeah. I'll give you a couple of guys that are going to be down the list a little bit. One of them would be Bryce Huff, who's an edge guy out of the Jets. He was an undrafted free agent, has proven that he can be very consistent at getting after quarterback. He's not going to break the bank, but he's a guy that's young enough that you could sign to a 3 or 4 year deal. Again, he's not going to break the bank, but he could come in and be that guy opposite Aiden that goes out there and really produces not only by himself. And I like the idea of having him along with James Houston, along with Aiden Hutchinson, Aleem McNeil, and the ability to move all of those guys around. We know that, AG loves to be able to use those guys in multiple positions. And he's a guy, in passing downs, you want him on the edge, but at different times you can sprinkle him in on the inside. He's a little bit undersized for that, but creates a mismatch at times. And another guy out of Houston, opposite
Greenard,
Greenard.
Jonathan Greenard.
I think would be another guy who's young, is not going to be at a high price tag, but could be a guy that you again sign for 4 years and continues to produce at a high level. He was opposite Will Anderson, benefited a lot by teams that were shifting to Will Anderson and turning protections to him. But I think it opens things up for him on this defense. It also opens things up for Aiden. Anytime you add somebody up front, and that's why I would be more inclined to add somebody at a higher end up front than on the back end, because I got some of the guys like you're talking about, older 31, 32-year-old guys that I think you could put on the back end, but I would like to have some fresh legs, some younger bodies up front for some of the wear and tear.
Yeah, and Bryce Huff for me is a guy, when you watch his film, I mean, there's times where he looks like an all-pro Hall of Fame rusher.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? With his burst, his get off, his bend, his agility. I don't mind that as long as you do your homework, right? Because there's a reason I think maybe why Bryce Huff was maybe kind of a situational guy with the Jet. Like it looked like they never trusted him to be like a 3 down player.
Right.
It was almost, hey, just play on 3rd down and go use your speed and put some pressure on the quarterback. I don't mind if you go get a guy like that, but I think there might be a little bit more homework to do there as far as why could this guy never figure out a role with the Jets?
It all depends on the price you're going to pay him.
Exactly.
You're not going to pay him for a 3 down guy, but you're going to pay him for 12 sacks.
A couple other names I just wanted to throw out, and this was the connection part. Obviously, we know AG and Dan Campbell aren't that far removed from still being in New Orleans. They still had a couple really good players. One of them, Marcus Davenport, was a 1st-round guy in New Orleans, big edge guy. Could play a 5 tech, might even be able to play a 3 tech for you. He's had some injury concerns. He went to Minnesota after New Orleans. Had one nice year. I think he had 8 or 9 sacks, was a really nice player. And then he was kind of injured, right? Obviously there's a New Orleans connection there. Both those guys were there when he was taken in the 1st round, and maybe might fit the mold of a guy who might be a little bit forgotten based off of injury history. Yeah. I could see maybe Marcus Davenport being a guy maybe later on, maybe week 2 into free agency, if it goes that far, to say, hey, let's see if this guy's got anything left in the tank. Obviously, we got to make sure we feel comfortable on the medical part of it. But I think he's a guy that might be able to kind of rejuvenate his career a little bit with maybe when you pair him again with some familiarity with Aaron Glenn and bring him into this defense. And another guy, Sheldon Rankins. He was an interior guy. Sheldon Rankins was, for me, one of the most underrated defensive tackles in this league, probably 3 years ago when he was with New Orleans. And he was a beast, and he was very good. And then he went to New York. First couple of years there, I mean, I thought he was really good. And then he's kind of a name that I think he's 30 years old now. So he's not getting the hype and the attention that obviously a guy like Christian Wilkins is going to get. He was in
Houston last year, right?
And then I think he was in Houston. Yeah. But I think he was in the Jets he was at the Jets for maybe a year, maybe 2 years. And then I think you end up in Houston, but veteran type guy, right? There's a little bit of a connection there, obviously, with Aaron Glenn, being familiar with him from their time in New Orleans. So those might be some sleeper guys to look at like we mentioned, maybe not the top end guys that would get everybody, oh my God, we can't give it. Right. But I think those are a couple names too that maybe we should watch over the next couple of days to see if there's a potential reunion. And I think both those names as well would be able to help out, bring in a little bit more of that veteran presence to the defensive line that you have right now. That is still pretty young.
So I've got two guys on the back end before I switch to one guy offensively.
I know I said top 5. We already listed like 15 names.
What the hell?
Yeah.
So, hey, we'll take them all.
Top 20 list.
Two guys in the secondary that I think they'll probably wait the market out a little bit to see, because there's they've had, great careers. They're a little bit older. One of them, Stephon Gilmore. I think we talked about him last week.
Yeah.
He's going to see probably where let it play out a little bit, let the market set itself and see where he fits in. He might even be a guy that doesn't sign until closer to camp. I think he would be a great addition. Obviously, I think he's 32, 33 years old. He'd be a guy
I think,
that you've got this small window where you're going to have a little bit of extra money to be able to spend, but you don't want to commit it long term. Some of the guys that you talked about, probably older guys, 30, 31, probably going to sign a 2 or 3 year deal. I think Stephon Gilmore, it might even be just a 1 year deal that they bring him in and let him perform in the secondary. Another guy that was just released by Miami, Xavier Howard. I think he could be a guy who's 31. You signed him to a 2 year deal. He'd be a great upgrade in the secondary, a guy that can be your number one cover corner opposite Cam Sutton, that I think could go out there and instantly upgrade that position with great experience. And it, again, allows AG to be very creative with how he uses the secondary.
Yeah, and I like both those names. And there's, I think you're really going to have an opportunity to find probably 2 or maybe 3 really, really good secondary pieces to add to this team. We know the safety market is completely saturated right now. I mean, there are like 20 starting safeties that are going to be available just with all the releases, right? The Bills released both of their guys, Micah Hyde, Jordan Poyer. Denver released Justin Simmons, who has been an all-pro type guy, for his entire career. That is a ball hawk type safety. Look, we haven't heard anything when it comes to Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, right? And if the Lions even have any plans of bringing him back. So that's going to be another hole that you're going to have to fill. I think we saw how complex this defense could be when they kind of ran that 3 safety look last year. We obviously expect Ife Melifonwu to be a big part of this defense moving forward. And Kirby Joseph certainly to be a piece, but do they look at that safety position and say, hey, we can get an automatic upgrade right now and get it at a buyer's fair market value, since there's so many of these guys on the market? Could you go after a guy like a Jordan Poyer? Could you go after a guy like Justin Simmons? I mean, that to me would be another home run, giving Aaron Glenn more talent on the back end to work with. A couple other names. And look, I know we're not talking about L'Jarius Sneed because that would be a trade piece, right? That's not part of the free agent, although he's probably going to be a guy that, if he does get moved, will probably happen over the next week or two, if not the next couple of days. But a couple other names, Sean Murphy-Bunting is a guy that was really interesting to me. I mean, he played 4 years with Tampa Bay, was a huge part of their Super Bowl run, was a huge part of their playoff run. I think the year they won the Super Bowl, he had like an interception, I think, in every game. Local guy, I think it was a Central Michigan talent coming out of the draft. He was a guy, and I think changed Tampa Bay's defense when they decided to let him walk. If you remember last year, they kind of had Tampa Bay either had to pay Sean Murphy-Bunting or they had to pay, I think it was Jamel Dean, who was the other free agent corner. They chose Jamel Dean and let Sean Murphy-Bunting walk. And that secondary for Tampa, to me, was not the same. Sean Murphy-Bunting was outside guy on early downs, and then, hey, on third downs when they'd bring in some other players, he could move inside, he could move to safety, a valuable piece. He went to Tennessee last year on a 1 year deal. He's still pretty young. I think he's 26 years old. I think that could be a guy that could be intriguing to say maybe he's not going to be at the high end of the corner market. Maybe that's a guy that could be a tier 2 type guy, like we saw with Cam Sutton coming in last year, or an Emmanuel Mosley coming in last year, but a guy that's had a past of being a number one corner. You'd still need more pieces, and maybe you do it by, just finding your best matches. Hey, we're not going to play number one, number two. We're just going to find our best matches. I think Sean Murphy-Bunting could be a guy where if they brought him in, probably wouldn't have any issue with it. I know his ball productivity was down a little bit last year in Tennessee, but that was a horrific defense. So he could be a guy that I would target. And maybe on the second tier, like we mentioned, a Jordan Poyer, a guy who's a veteran guy. Micah Hyde was a guy that I played with in Green Bay, who's still around the NFL, who had a neck issue, I think a couple years ago, maybe early last year, ended up coming back. He's still a hell of a player. And just knowing him personally would be also a guy, when you talk about what kind of character are they, what kind of person are they, I think would be a perfect fit for what Dan Campbell and Aaron Glenn are trying to do. I wanted to throw one more at you and just get your opinion here. Do you think there's any chance that maybe the Lions, and this is the other side of the ball, make it a priority to try to go and get another receiver? Because we know, we know that Jameson Williams is going to be expected to step into a bigger role. But we also know how big a guy like Josh Reynolds was for this team last year, kind of playing that number 3 role. Kind of being that big body type guy, dude that can get open over the middle of the field. Because there's a couple names right now, the guys that interest me. I have no idea what the market's going to be, but I'm just going to give it to you. Like a guy like Gabe Davis out of Buffalo, who kind of fell out of favor out there, was a really good intermediate. It even had a lot of deep threat ability. I don't know what the market's going to look like for him, but even a guy like Calvin Ridley, who, look, we know a couple years ago what he did, had to sit out the whole year. Yeah. But he went down to Jacksonville, and I think the NFL kind of caught on that maybe this guy's not a number 1, right? He was really good in Atlanta when they had Julio Jones in his prime. He was a really good number 2. Last year in Jacksonville, they kind of forced him into that number 1 role, and it just didn't work out, right? They figured, all right, this offense has to run through Christian Kirk, and Calvin needs to be our number 2 guy. Do you think there's any chance that maybe they put a priority on finding another receiver that can come in and kind of fill that Josh Reynolds role? I'm not saying break the bank for one of the top guys, but maybe find a guy that's been an experienced veteran that we know has some big playability that can come in and maybe be a part of this offense.
I think Calvin Ridley would be a perfect fit. I'm not sure they're going to want to pay what he may.
Depends on what it looks like.
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
I don't know.
And I do think that they could go out there and find another guy that maybe is a bigger target. Obviously, Calvin Ridley, he's a guy that could go out there and give you the speed and the quickness off the line of scrimmage, be a very Josh Reynolds type guy. But I also think that you might want to go and get a big receiver that's a 50-50 ball type of guy. You got Laporta, you got some of those guys, but yeah, I could see that. I don't think that would be a week 1 ad in free agency. That would be more of a, maybe late week 1, or once the market sets itself and everybody gets tiered off of that to see who they could add. The other guy, and I'm just going to hit it quick because the offensive line is it's the straw that stirs the drink in Detroit. We all know that. And signing Graham is definitely a sign that they want to keep that a priority. They want to make sure that stays a strength. You lose Jonah Jackson, but a guy that could come in and provide you tremendous position flexibility as well as a stud player, Michael Onwenu.
It's going to cost you a lot.
It's going to cost you. and so it just goes to, what are you willing to pay? So I'm not willing to pay Jonah Jackson. I'm not willing to pay Robert Hunt, who I think would be a major upgrade. But if you pay Michael Onwenu, just like you're talking about some of these guys that, hey, they got position flexibility on the defensive side of things. He'd be a guy, he's played all 4 spots up front. He's not going to play center, but could play either guard spot, could play either tackle spot. I wouldn't really want him at left tackle, but you got 2 guys that could fill that role. But he could be a guy, if Decker goes down and you've got to move over Sewell, he could play right tackle. He could play left guard. He could play any position up front that you need him to play with that position flexibility. And you're going to pay for it because he's a top end tackle. Yeah.
And look, I mean, if they decide that we're going to make one big play and it happens to be an offensive lineman, I think a lot of us would understand that. Yeah. That's, like you said, that's the position that makes this team go. I just can't picture Aaron Glenn walking into that office, after free agency and looking at the board and everything just still being the same. I think if you're Aaron Glenn, you have to almost demand that, I need more talent, guys. You know what I mean? Like, I need more talent. You guys have spent a lot on the offensive side of the ball. It's my turn. I want to go look at that board, and I want to see a new corner. I want to go see a new safety. I want to see another piece that I can use up front. So I would have, obviously, neither of us would have an issue if you decide to go out and get a high-end offensive lineman that can come in and you can say, hey, man, our offense is set. Now we can hopefully find some veteran deals or maybe spend the entirety of the draft helping the defense out. I don't think we would mind that. But like we said, this is obviously always a fun time of year, and it'll be interesting. I guarantee you there's going to be people that are moaning and bitching and griping over the next couple of days saying, oh, why didn't the Lions get him? But I do think that there might be still a small chance where we see maybe a big name guy that can come in or maybe a couple of these, like we already ripped off a ton of the more veteran type guys that maybe you can get late into the week, maybe next week, to come on in and say, hey, we'll give you a 1-2 year deal that can come be big impact players for this team. So I don't know. I'm excited, man. This is always a fun time of year. There's always a bunch of rumors going on, and it finally gives us something to talk about after what feels like eternity since the season ended. So we will see what happens. Maybe we'll get together, later in the week, if anything big does happen, and kind of break down free agency and what the Lions have been able to do over the next couple of days. But John, I just hope, like I mentioned at the start, man, I'll finish it the same way. I think you got to come out of free agency with 2 starters. I really do. As long as they get 2 starters, I don't care if they're the highest priced guys or veteran guys on 1-year deals, because this team, we obviously both feel the same, is ready to win now.
Yep. Well, we'll bring you the breakdown of free agency as it continues to roll along. Give you our reaction, our excitement or disappointment. But we thank you for listening to Necessary Roughness.